James Whales's 1934 production of Bride of Frankenstein is considered by many contemporary critics to be a masterpiece of filmmaking and a poignant meditation on religion, isolation, and the nature of humanity. The film has only aged like wine since its initial release, and it continues to be referenced as one of the more culturally significant additions to the vast collection of American horror and monster cinema. However, despite the film's moniker, The Bride of Frankenstein focuses very little on the bride herself and instead follows the monster, as he struggles to find some semblance of acceptance in a human community. In fact, the bride does not even appear on screen until the final 10 minutes of the movie. Her existence really serves an allegorical purpose, representing the monster's inability to generate meaningful connections and thus unable to create his own community. Despite her striking beauty, the bride is the film's true monster. She embodies the monster's isolation, his marginalization, and the threat of monstrous reproduction. Her monstrosity, most interestingly, is not framed sympathetically or humanized like her male counterpart, but is instead devoid of humanity. The only time she utters a sound or betrays any glimmer of comprehension is when she gazes upon the monster and releases a primordial scream. By recounting the details of this film, I don't mean to suggest that The Bride of Frankenstein is the origin point for all contemporary depictions of monster women, only that she quintessentially demonstrates a tradition of feminine monsterization that continues in filmmaking today. It is a modern tradition that even influences the reconstruction of our most ancient texts, and the story of Beowulf is no exception. Cinematic adaptations of Beowulf tend to fall on a broad spectrum of interpretations that are more concerned with conveying contemporary ideologies and entertaining a mass audience than preserving the accuracy of the text. Rather than criticize or impose any moral implications on this common practice, I am rather attempting to draw attention to the additive creative decisions that filmmakers will often apply in areas where the source material feels ambiguous or empty. Specifically, Grendel's mother is a point of creative contention. In modern Beowulf adaptations, her visual aesthetic and narrative role are expanded in ways that reflect today's archetypal notions of monstrosity, a process which often heavily sexualizes her body and exaggerates her features of difference. But this manipulation of Grendel's mother is not limited to film. Each piece of Beowulf media, whether a direct translation or a cinematic portrayal, participates in renegotiating her monstrosity and obscuring her function in the Old English text. Using Zemeckis' 2007 Beowulf film as a focus point, I intend to explore how and why modern conceptions of feminine monstrosity are projected onto Grendel's mother by examining the tropes associated with monster women in contemporary film. In doing so, I will juxtapose the ways in which Zemeckis' depiction of Grendel's mother clashes with her presence in the original Beowulf text. Before we begin to diagnose England's oldest monster woman, we must answer a few preliminary questions. What even is a monster woman, and how is she made? In film, the monster woman can take on many shapes. Whether she be a witch, an alien, a robot, or a ghost, the monster woman can potentially occupy a wide spread of genres and narratives. As is the case with any kind of monster, the monster woman represents an amalgamation of cultural anxieties. In monster theory, reading culture, medievalist monster scholar Jerome Cohen argues that the monster is created at, quote, metaphoric crossroads, as an embodiment of a certain cultural moment, of a time, a feeling, and a place. The monster's body quite literally incorporates fear, desire, anxiety, and fantasy, giving them life and an uncanny independence. A construct and projection, the monster exists only to be read, end quote. One need not look very far to find the truth of this. The original Frankenstein's monster, having been procedurally sewn together with various dead body parts, concretizes cultural anxieties surrounding scientific advancements in the early 19th century. Similarly, the 1995 Japanese horror film Ring reveals technological cultural tensions as Sadako, the film's ghostly monster lady, murders people by traveling through VHS tapes and TV screens. On a more nuanced level, most monster ladies tend to embody general cultural anxieties regarding the roles of women in their societies. When her womanhood becomes nebulous and difficult to define, Cohen argues that the monster manifests a crisis of category. Quote, this refusal to participate in the classificatory order of things is true of monsters generally. They are disturbing hybrids whose externally incoherent bodies resist attempts to include them in any systematic structuration. End quote. Rarely are monster women fully unrecognizable beings, completely and totally alien from humanity. Often, in fact, cinematic monster women will appear mostly human. Their monstrous signifiers are either muted or hidden for the majority of the film until the narrative needs them to kill someone. Syl from Species, Ava from Ex Machina, Amenet from The Mummy, and a host of other monster women exist in hybridity, not quite human despite their appearances. These human features can even temporarily disguise the aspects of these women that a contemporary audience finds truly monstrous. The specter of corrupted feminine leadership, perverse motherhood that produces monstrous children, and, by extension, a perverse hypersexuality. This leads us, I think, to the next segment of this essay. The hypersexual framing of monster women on film neatly demonstrates what film critic Laura Mulvey first coins as the male gaze in her 1975 essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema. Being manipulated by heterosexual men for heterosexual men, the concept of the male gaze stipulates that the lens of the camera takes on voyeuristic qualities when it rests upon the bodies of women. A.W. Eaton, a feminist critical theorist, further elaborates in Feminist Philosophy of Art that, quote, a picture need not ever be viewed by heterosexual men in order to exemplify the male gaze, because the term refers to the viewpoint or attitude that a picture adopts and the response that it prescribes to its audience. Male and female, heterosexual and homosexual, namely a sexually objectifying attitude toward the woman or women depicted, end quote. This pervasive cinematic phenomena has everything to do with the gendered inequalities of power that persist in the film industry, wherein an overwhelming number of male directors, writers, and editors make decisions about the visual representation of women. The camera, then, is typically a medium of male perceptions and desires which are then projected upon female bodies. Monster women, on the other hand, inhabit these sexualized projections to the extreme. Cohen argues that monsters are the policers of cultural borders, quote, embodying these sexual practices that must not be committed, or that may be committed only through the body of the monster. The monster enforces the cultural codes that regulate sexual desire, end quote. The exaggerated sexuality of the monstrous woman is catastrophic because her body is the alluring conduit through which she can obtain corrupted power, monstrous children, or both. A number of films can attest to this fact. The entire plot of Species involves a half-alien woman frantically searching for a man to have sex with so that she can have alien children. The Enchantress of Hellboy makes herself sexually available to the titular character so that she can effectively become Queen of Hell. The succubus Jennifer of Jennifer's Body entices men before she eats them in exchange for supernatural abilities, and so on. According to these films, hypersexuality is a tool for the monstrous woman to achieve her goals, but it is only a camouflage to hide her hideous, equally monstrous interiority. It would suffice to say that the modern cinematic monster woman symbolizes contemporary cultural anxieties about women in positions of authority, and the foreboding prospect that these women will produce cultural others. The construction of these women is a deliberate one. They destabilize the political dimensions of the narrative by threatening to dismantle homosexual ties, and as the audience, we are positioned to find them violent and threatening. It comes as no surprise, then, that when Grendel's mother is depicted on screen in Beowulf adaptations, she's repeatedly and disappointingly represented as some kind of atavistic demon lady who exerts a sexual spell over men. But the inaccuracies involved in this portrayal are not just that she is represented as sexually monstrous, but that she is even portrayed as excessively monstrous at all. The story of Beowulf is one of 5 texts found in the Noble Codex, a collection of Old English works that include a description of the life of St. Christopher, Wonders of the East, a translation of a letter from Alexander to Aristotle, and a poetic translation of Judith. At first glance, these disparate texts seem like odd choices to assemble into one compilation, but scholarship from Andy Orchard's Pride and Prodigies, Studies in the Monsters of the Beowulf manuscript, has proposed that monstrosity is the thematic thread connecting them all together. This certainly holds true for Beowulf, as monsters catalyze and structure the narrative. In Beowulf, the titular protagonist of the Yachts travels to the Danish kingdom to help King Hrothgar kill Grendel, a cannibalistic monster who has terrorized Herod for the past 12 years. After slaying Grendel, Beowulf proceeds to kill Grendel's mother, and the end of the text deals with Beowulf killing a dragon and dying in the process. Most medievalist scholarship paid little attention to Grendel's mother until the 1980s, a transition that was articulated succinctly by Jane Chance's article, The Structural Unity of Beowulf, The Problem of Grendel's Mother. The article argues that Beowulf should be viewed in a three-part narrative structure, where the roles of women and their significance, in addition to the monstrous presence of Grendel's mother, are most visible in the middle of the narrative. Scholarship remains contentious regarding the presence and function of women in Beowulf. Many of the noble women mentioned in the text are directly referred to as peace pledges, or peace weavers, a political role held by aristocratic women who are married into other communities to settle feuds and to produce royal heirs. Chance argues that Queen Wealhtheow, Hrothgar's wife and the only woman who speaks in the text, demonstrates the tenets of peace-weaving by, among other things, ritualistically passing mead between the king and his retainers as a way of strengthening their communal bonds. Medievalist scholar Jacek Olisiko further elaborates that Wealhtheow is presented as an ideal embodiment of peace-weaving, who uses her privileged, gendered speech to smooth over the potential problems created by men. This isn't to say that noble women are always successful at peace-weaving. After he returns to the Yachts, Beowulf correctly surmises that Freywaru, Wealhtheow and Hrothgar's daughter, will not be able to soothe the deep-seated conflicts between the Danes and the Heathebards. Nevertheless, peace-weaving is the difficult standard against which most Anglo-Saxon noble women are measured. Grendel's mother arrives at a point in the text when the stories and speeches involving peace-weaving women are most visible to the reader. Seeking revenge for the death of her son, Grendel's mother swoops into Heorot and kills Hrothgar's best friend, Ashera, before taking off. Beowulf promises Hrothgar to avenge his friend's death, and follows Grendel's mother to an underwater hall where the two proceed to wrestle in a death match. Unlike his fight with Grendel, Beowulf can't just grapple her with his bare hands or stab her with Unferth's sword. In fact, she gets the jump on him and nearly stabs him. Luckily, Beowulf notices an ancient, powerful sword in her underwater hall, and he uses it to kill his opponent. Despite what contemporary English translations of these scenes with Grendel's mother would have us believe, Grendel's mother does not possess abnormal features or exaggerated physicalities that would imply monstrosity. According to Christine Alfano in The Issue of Feminine Monstrosity, a reevaluation of Grendel's mother, translators ride a tenuous balance between literal translation and artistic rendering, but the cost of this creative license has had the tendency of invoking contemporary biases that, quote, transform an avenging mother into a bloodthirsty monster, end quote. Instead of hands, Grendel's mother is given claws. Instead of a warrior woman, Grendel's mother is called a monstrous ogress and a monster woman. Modern translations seem concerned with effectively stripping Grendel's mother of her humanity, despite the fact that the Old English text gives no indication that she is something other than human. Wendy Hennequin furthers this argument in We've Created a Monster, The Strange Case of Grendel's Mother, asserting that translators make assumptions about Grendel's mother's monstrosity because she, quote, does not behave like Wealhtheow, Heod, or Hildebert, whom scholars consider to be proper models of womanhood, end quote. Rather than a monster, Grendel's mother's true crime is her masculine behavior. Fighting and avenging are coded as masculine activities in the Anglo-Saxon world, but Grendel's mother participates in these behaviors and is occasionally assigned masculine pronouns while doing so. In her own hall, Grendel's mother as king, Hennequin even proposes that Grendel's mother functioned in the text as a king who possesses all the markers of rulership, including a hall, treasure, and an ancestral sword. All the evidence would point to the conclusion that Grendel's mother is not some kind of perverse inversion of womanhood or queenship, but is actually a warrior standing on relatively equal footing with Beowulf. Since this essay is in the business of diagnosing contemporary portrayals of Grendel's mother, I think it's safe to say that filmmakers take some of their cues from the interpretive decisions of Beowulf translators. The 2007 cinematic adaptation of Beowulf is a motion-captured animated film directed by Robert Zemeckis and written by Neil Gaiman and Roger Avary. Unlike most Beowulf adaptations, I need to give this particular film some credit for attempting to remain faithful to the source material in odd but creative ways. Of course, the film still departs from the text on a number of key plot points. Perhaps the most jarring distinction between the text and the film is the representation of Grendel's mother. When she finally arrives on screen, we are confronted with a very naked and a very golden Angelina Jolie. The audience soon learns that the deformed Grendel was fathered by Hrothgar and that Grendel's mother routinely seduces powerful men to help her produce monstrous children. By the end of the film, we see Beowulf's own monster child in the form of a golden dragon before Beowulf strikes him down and dies alongside him. The final shot of the film focuses on Grendel's mother as she appears off in the distance, implying to the viewer that the cycle of monster sex can and will continue. Granted, this Grendel's mother's precise motivation for doing anything is ambiguous, but if we follow the contemporary model of hypersexualized monster women, then we at least understand that her portrayal is the product of several intersecting cultural dynamics. By the time Beowulf premiered in theaters in 2007, Angelina Jolie had already established herself as a fairly versatile actress and an international sex symbol, thanks largely to her role as Lara Croft in the 2001 Tomb Raider. Casting her as Grendel's mother communicates to the audience that this character is intended to exude allure, or at the very least, a similar sex appeal that she has projected in previous roles. But the hypersexuality of this character isn't her only distinguishing feature. As revealed by the character's introductory scene, Jolie chooses to adopt a vaguely foreign accent.
Such a strong man you are, with the strength of a king. The king you will one day become.
I would hesitate to place her accent into any specific linguistic category or national identity, but it's safe to say that her vocal inflections are ambiguous enough to constitute a blanket cultural otherness. In the chapter, Hero, Monster, Masturbator, Gaiman and Avery's Beowulf, Alice Mills argues that the film's writers placed Grendel's mother inside an assortment of literary traditions that conflate the tropes about magical, distrustful women. Quote, as kingmaker, as a prophetess whose magic powers help her prophecy to come true, her affinities lie with the witches in Macbeth. As an antagonist whom the king cannot kill, she is analogous to Arthur's Morgan Le Fay. End quote. Constructed this way, Angelina Jolie's Grendel's mother is the perfect vehicle for hosting a mass of contemporary cultural anxieties. What makes her so monstrous in this film is twofold: her ability to produce monstrous, destructive offsprings, and her power as a cruel, mystical puppeteer. Grendel's mother replaces fate, pulling the strings and deciding what will be in the world of Beowulf. Placed in such a deific position, her power exceeds that of any other character in the film, and as an audience, we are meant to find it extremely disconcerting that she can manipulate events around her so effortlessly. Again, we see here in the contemporary Grendel's mother that women in positions of authority threaten patriarchal communities, spurring a cultural desire to turn them into monsters. Their children, as cultural others, further threaten these communities by inhabiting them and slowly dismantling previous institutions of power. Of course, we do live in a capitalist society. The reason this characterization of monster women persists at all is because intricate networks of profit-based entertainment insist that it should. Bethany Wood explains in Gentlemen Prefer Adaptations, addressing industry and gender in adaptation studies, that, quote, endurance rests in the act of adaptation, from serial to film and back again, revealing the intersections of industry that work to perpetuate constructs of femininity as long as the constructs sell. Adaptations thus underscore larger issues of representation and identity for in-profit entertainment by highlighting the inner industrial systems poised to advance constructs, no matter how problematic, based on profit alone. End quote. The tropes which increase box office returns and our collective unconscious biases are locked in a kind of eternal Ouroboros which change slowly and quietly. All of the underlying cultural attitudes which shaped the 2007 adaptation of Beowulf, and by extension Grendel's mother, are repeatedly concretized by the flow of capital. This interpretation of Grendel's mother will, in the meantime, influence future adaptive works relating to this heroic poem. Ultimately, the decisions that modern filmmakers make about Beowulf says more about our current social and cultural moment than the era of the early Anglo-Saxons, no matter how faithful or accurate the film claims to be. Even in the arena of translation, scholarly experts in the field of medieval studies continuously misrepresent aspects of the text relating to Grendel's mother, exaggerating her monstrosity and dehumanizing her function in the text. Zemeckis' adaptation of Beowulf is far from the first film to insert a hypersexual monster woman as a primary antagonist, but I think it's important to recognize that this construction exists in a cinematic canon that makes monsters out of our most misogynistic anxieties. To be clear, I do not think that adaptations of old texts necessarily need to be faithful or even accurate to the source material, only that these adaptations should at least endeavor to craft an entertaining piece of media that, with any luck, doesn't rely too heavily on silly depictions of women.